journalist, talented MTV host, red carpet extraordinaire, someone who, if you see him, you know the face, you recognize the brand. Dometi, please join me.
Man himself.
You can say it. Still right next to him. Thank you. Moving right along, we're gonna invite Gutiérrez to the stage. My Afro-Latina sister. She is a body positivity activist. Someone who's also a filmmaker and an outspoken individual in the space. Moving right along, we'll invite our dearest Ytasha Womack, author, Afrofuturist, extraordinaire, filmmaker, storyteller, and all-around very insightful individual. And last but not least, we'll invite Charlique Rolle, Charlique, sorry. I gotta get these names, but this is an eclectic stage. Charlique is also a very well-connected woman in this space. Congo Square, she is the, I believe, executive director over there, as well as she is leading things over at the African American Arts Alliance. I won't butcher you all's intro. I'll allow you guys to introduce yourselves. We'll start with Dometi.
I can't do an intro better than yours, so I'm just happy to be here and very, very proud of Creative Cycle for convening this space. These films have been amazing, this conversation has been amazing, so just thank you for having us.
We'll go right down the line. You got it?
I'm on Mateo.
Come on, boots. Y'all see these boots?
These boots have a story too. If we have time, we'll talk. So my name is Lenny Gutiérrez. I'm an actor, filmmaker, body and social justice activist, and I'm incredibly excited to be here with you today.
Hi, my name is Ytasha Womack. I'm author of the book Afrofuturism, the World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture. Yes. I talk at large about that subject, and I have a book called The Black Panther, a cultural exploration about the history of the comic book and a lot of local references, actually. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm a filmmaker as well, so thank you.
This one, don't kill me. Don't kill me.
Nah. Hey y'all, Charlique Rolle here, Executive Director of Congo Square Theater, as well as President of the African American Arts Alliance. I am a filmmaker, producer, choreographer, director, actor, all the things and more.
Yeah.
Please, round of applause for our very eclectic, interesting guest. Yes. I'm Michael Abrantie, if you don't know, writer, director, filmmaker, producer of many different facets, all-around artist. But today it's not about me. Today it's about the role of the diaspora. And some people don't quite understand, you know, what we mean when we say the diaspora. It is the children of Africa. It is those of us who are in other places outside of the continent who still identify and relate with the continent in one way or another. And I think we have a shared experience. We have a shared lived experience. And oftentimes we don't talk about what our counterparts around the world are doing, what they're up to, the things that they're also going through and experiencing. And so I really would like to get into that conversation. But we'll start with a bit of history, right? And so when we talk about the film industry at large, and especially in the continent, we don't get nearly enough praise for some of the more innovative works that African filmmakers in particular have, imparted on the world at large. You know, one that we can start is 1973, a director by the name of Gutiérrez and Dometi, who created a film called Tuki Buki. And if you guys are familiar with that, it's a Senegalese work of art that almost revolutionized how we look at African cinema. At the time, there was no such works coming out, experimental, very daring, very moving works that touched in spirituality and touched in what the common life was like for a West African at the time. And since then, you've had a slew and onslaught of filmmakers who've also done really dope things on the continent. You fast forward to 2015, we got Beast of No Nation, not an African director, but African producers and actors and filmed on the continent that actually was filmed in Ghana, with Idris Elba leading that up. And that's where we start to have further conversations around what the capabilities are when we talk about filming outside of the United States in regards to Black stories. You fast forward just a little bit further, in 2018, you get Berry of Cujo with director Blitz Bazawuli, who delved into another experimental style of filmmaking. Fast forward now, he's the director of the new Color Purple. And so when we look at what we're doing there and the lack of attention that is being put on it, I think it's worth a conversation. And I would like for us to dive into that conversation here. So we have people from different spectrums that play different roles when it comes to the diaspora. And I think, I think we can benefit a lot from having a conversation that is a bit more robust and a bit more vast in regards to the role that we play in our industry. And so I want to kick off with a question around, how do we fit in the Western lens of things? Like where do we fit in the Western lens, and do we really have to fit in the Western lens? And I'll kick it to whoever wants to start off this conversation.
I'm gonna see all these more qualified people. I'm like, I don't want to be the first person to speak when I got Charlique on the stage and Ytasha, but I think that conversation, it's an interesting question because I think for so long, Africans have tried to endear ourselves to Western civilization, so much so that how many of y'all have gone back to Ghana December? Anybody have gone this year or in recent years? Come on. Okay, so if you go in December, some of the recipes and the food that we make isn't how it is year round because a lot of Ghanaians believe that, the Americans, they can't eat pepper and spicy food, so we're gonna change the recipe. So a lot of times, I use that as an analogy because we change our recipes to appeal for the Western palate. And our recipes suffer as a result of that. So when we think about, should we even endear ourselves to Western civilization? We don't have to, and the value in our stories is keeping our recipes exactly as they are because they don't change theirs to appeal to us.
Speaking.
It's on your seat. Your mic.
All right.
I think to deepen into that, I think it's really important to get clear on, you get to decide how you want to tell your story and what part Western culture has played in your life and how it has developed you or harmed you, whatever that is, you get to decide that. And I think that's what's, from my perspective, the most important part about that we so often have all these litmus tests of what makes us Black enough, what makes a story Black enough, what makes it this enough or that enough. And we marginalize ourselves and don't allow ourselves to fully expand into our story because nobody is an expert on your lived experience but you. Nobody. And yet we feel that we have to fit into these categories that have been created by Western culture, but also by Black folks as well. We create these categories and then we snuff each other out. And there's this excoriation of the work that is made if it doesn't fit into the space or in the way that we think it ought to look, or the way we think Black looks. But Black's a multitude of ways. And that's important to understand.
Come on.
When I think about, Black culture is so diverse. And I have to thank my family because I grew up here in Chicago, and one of the things they sort of instilled early on was, hey, look, okay, our roots, part of our story is coming through the transatlantic slave trade. We're proud to be African American, but don't get it twisted. The fact that your ancestors wound up in America is somewhat arbitrary. They could have wound up in the Bahamas, they could have wound up in Cuba, they could have wound up in Mexico, Brazil, Jamaica, St. Vincent, all of the places, or something could have happened where no one left at all. So when you're meeting people within your culture, be mindful, you could be meeting a relative.
Yes.
You could be meeting somebody who you could have been in their place because there's no dynamic, there's no way to explain why or how we wound up in some of these places. So I was sharing with some of the panelists how I just came from Ghana recently, and we went with the family, and part of the trip, of course, is going to the castles, which is, I will not go deep into that because it's a very, very deep experience. But when you just think about the level of resilience, right? You think about this reaction of, on the one hand, you have people in the diaspora who are, whether they came here through forced migrations or otherwise, who are always trying to maintain a connection or reconnect, right? They're trying to sever a kind of separation. And then you have this dynamic of people on the continent who, in thinking of the forced migrations, people who left during the transatlantic slave trade or were stolen away, you know, there's this idea of a sense of loss, and that being compounded over centuries. And so we're kind of played against each other because there's oceans separating us, and there's false national borders separating us, and there's ideologies that we're just so different. And the reality is that a lot of elements of who we are, we adapted based on where we went. Whether you wound up in Mississippi or you wound up in Cuba, et cetera, people made adaptations to Western ideas based on where they were. And if you're in the diaspora, and I like to always emphasize this, we help shape what the West is.
Yes.
So this idea that we're not Western, you've got 1 foot in the West, you got 1 foot in Africa, and in the Afrofuturist vein of things, they like to say, well, that's like a cyborg life. W.B. Du Bois would have said, you know, it's double consciousness. You know, and sometimes people who are first, second generation immigrants, they talk about feeling like they're trying to merge two worlds.
Yeah.
Well, that is an existence. It's not two worlds, it's one. And it's embodied. And you're trying to find how these things reconcile. And so the piece that comes from trying to sever this idea of separation, you know, because we fall into the idea of this separation, and we're more connected. You know, one of the things I've just reminded of when we, you know, going to different places, I've spent a lot of time in Cuba and in Senegal, is that we have, to the extent that we lost various things through these migrations, we've reclaimed more than we thought, and we've influenced one another way more than we talk about. And there's a strength in that. You can go into Dakar and Dakar's in Senegal, and you can see hip hop battles, and they're doing capoeira, which went from Angola to Brazil, and people are doing, you know, kizomba, which is a partner dance that's coming out of Cape Verde and Angola. And so much of who we are, we're shaping one another and not always pulling on that particular strength. So I just think that lens of thinking of ourselves as, yes, I'm a Chicagoan, or yes, you know, I'm African American, and that's part of my experience, but it's part of a broader experience. And the more we try to build that connection or acknowledge that connection, that you're part of a broader experience, which doesn't negate where you're from and what you went through. Yeah. You know, that's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You gave us a nice earful there, and I think one of the common threads you mentioned is adapting, right? And I don't know if anyone here has ever seen the types of films that come out of West Africa in particular, but by show of hands, have you guys ever seen the movies that come out of West Africa, Nigeria? There is a common thread of adaptation when it comes to Hollywood developed under money. And these industries that are coming out of quote unquote third world countries are developing under shared passion. And so you get genres that are created out of people just being passionate about storytelling. You get Nollywood, which is, you know, a word that derived from Bollywood, which is the films that come out of India, but Nollywood is the Nigerian film industry, which is bigger than life. And then you get Gollywood, that's happening in Ghana. But the style of film is something that you have to get used to. It's something that you have to build a taste for. So you're like, I developed a taste for it. Very over dramatic, you know, elongated storylines that go into, you know, tangents.
elongated.
Very, very elongated storylines.
I was watching one, you know how normally in movies, when somebody get out the car, you just cut and they in the living room?
Yeah.
In Ghanaian films, they will walk from here to here. This is a 4-hour film that could have been 30 minutes. Okay. No, I'm sorry. That's like my biggest pet peeve.
Like, we grew up watching these movies that would be 3 hours long, and there would be 3 parts to it. It's part 1, part 2, and part 3. By the time you get to part 3, it's a different movie. It doesn't have the same characters. The main character died in movie 1. It's a trilogy that goes and goes and goes and goes. But that is the adaptation that created this genre, or the subgenre. And I also consider Afrofuturism as a subgenre of just Afro storytelling, Afro folklore. I think as we adapt, I see now we have, they're relating Tubi as another platform that gives light and gives voice to these subgenres of we're gonna make this movie whether we have $1 to our name or we have 500. And I think it is something to say about our resilience as a people, that we refuse to not tell our story. And I think as we continue to do that, we have to acknowledge the stories that our Afro-Brazilian brothers and sisters are going through. We have to acknowledge the stories that people in Cuba that look like us are also experiencing, because this is, like she said, that could be your relative. That's a shared experience, whether you like it or not. And I think what separates us is minuscule in the grand scheme of things. We look at propaganda and what makes us think that we're different from one another, which is not usually things that we fund. These are not things that are funded. Propaganda is never funded by us, but it's fueled by us. And unfortunately, we have to find ways to separate ourselves from identifying with that type of stuff. So I do challenge you all to take a look at some African cinema. But I say that to say things are changing. And so now we have a new breadth of African cinema. I call it New African Cinema, where there is a stronger relation to how movies are normally viewed in the West, and how we normally, if I can talk loud, how movies are normally viewed in the West. And there are a lot of talented directors and producers that are starting to do really dope things. And I think we have there's a call to action that I want to put on us to start to explore some of those works, because their stories that are being told are rooted in some of our old folklore that is passed down verbally. You have this oral tradition of storytelling that we're now beginning to translate into motion pictures. And I would challenge you guys to do that. But I posed a question to the stage around what's kind of our responsibility as people who are connected creators, as I like to say, to also shed light on some of these filmmakers, some of these projects. Like, what do you all feel like is our role to play as children of the diaspora?
Yeah. I think it is a critical role that we play in the storytelling, like we've already discussed. Black culture and Black people are not a monolith.
Yeah.
And there are so many different stories that are being told. We live in a country that is built on this tension of extreme intolerance and fake tolerance of whose stories are to be told. And when we think about just the oral traditions and the cultures that are passed down, I was born and raised in the Bahamas, spent all of my life there, wanted to be an artist from as long as I could remember, but never saw any clear representation of what excellence as a Bahamian looks like in storytelling, in stage, in film, anywhere. And then also thinking about what was defined as excellence was built in proximity to whiteness. And so I think taking our culture, our history, and like what the diaspora, what that clear point of intersection and connectedness is for us, that also is what makes us different and makes it so beautiful to have these stories be told, but to also understand that. So for us in this generation, in this room, it is our charge to continue to highlight the complexities of our culture, to highlight all of the stories that are being told, and not pinning it into this moment of this is what excellence is defined as, which has one, in our society, has one clear definition of excellence that is based on, again, proximity to whiteness and what white culture, dominant culture, has defined what that is. So as a people, we have to redefine and shift the perspective of what excellence looks like in telling our stories and creating more space for that. Like, what does it actually mean for us to create space? Because even across the diaspora, we can be intolerant of our own people and our own stories. So what does it mean for us to sit in this space and have power to say, these are all of my stories. I can see myself in Beyonce Part 3. Right? Like, listen, I was there. I was following Beyonce the whole time. And not Beyonce the singer. Beyonce the African film.
President's daughter.
Had 16 parts. In the Bahamas, as a teenager, watching that and saying, I felt more close to seeing myself represented in Beyonce than I did on an American film that was more blackness, perceived blackness, for sure.
And I think as creatives too, it's we have to feel comfortable allowing the story to dictate form. So, we're told to tell, our stories in a specific sort of way. That's very linear. You're writing a screenplay, it's the just traditional American storytelling. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's one way of telling the story. And I think what becomes really interesting when you're talking about watching African films or other films from around the world, sometimes you are watching stories where it starts with one character, and by the time you get to the end of the story, it's about a completely different person. And you're like, whoa, what happened? And I remember thinking the first time I started watching films like that, I'm like, what is going on? And I had to be open and receptive to, wait a second, there are other ways to tell a story. And then as I started going to like these experimental film showcases, and I have to acknowledge that Floyd Webb is here. Floyd has curated film festivals and film showcases in the Chicagoland area and elsewhere, bringing a lot of international films to the city. And I bring that up because it brought a lot of films that some of us wouldn't normally see into the neighborhoods. But in watching some of these and going to certain experimental spaces, I remember being in Amsterdam, and it was, there had thousands of people coming in to watch a film with no characters. It was literally a film deconstructing sound and light, and it was 2 hours long. And this was being held as, high art. And I'm not saying it wasn't, it was very fascinating, but I had to think, wow, if this is a group of people, they can do something, making a commentary about, a very abstract commentary on light and sound. Certainly, I can do a film where dance and rhythm are, are highlighted, or dance and rhythm are the leading arc of the story, or I can tell a story backwards, or I can do a host of things, which I had an opportunity to do with a film called A Love Letter to the Ancestors from Chicago and celebrating house music, etc. But that was my first sort of foray into stepping out of the traditional narrative. And there's nothing wrong with the traditional narrative, but I think you can be cognizant of when that narrative works for the story you want to tell, and when another way of telling the story might better capture your neighborhood. It might better capture your family experience. And it's like, just give yourselves, we're told to meet these particular marks to get films distributed, et cetera, and all of that has its place. But as artists, we have to give ourselves the space to creatively think of, to really connect with ourselves, to see how we want to tell our story, and actually do so, and then look at it, and build upon it or shape it accordingly.
Love that.
Yeah, that is so good. So good, yes. For me,
Y'all can clap for these things.
Yeah.
Y'all can clap.
So for me, I'm a Black Mexican from Topeka, Kansas. Okay?
Combination.
So, I grew up in a Mexican family with a white Mexican mother. Everybody else in my family had the same coloring as me. Nobody had the same hair as me. That was a journey. But that to be said, the pain of not seeing myself. The pain of not seeing myself on TV, the pain of not feeling like I saw myself in my mother, my dad was not around. What I know to be so is that there is power in seeing yourself reflected in stories, seeing yourself reflected in positions of power, And when you don't, the impact is so deeply detrimental. And the stories that we create when we don't see ourselves as kids is that there's something wrong with us and that we don't belong. And then what happens is the gift that we were given to specifically deploy into the world oftentimes doesn't make it. And mine almost didn't, because I attempted suicide when I was 16 because I was so sad and I didn't see myself. And what I know to be so in becoming an actor and a writer and a producer, and I've been writing a story, Las Palabras, which is loosely based on my life and straddling the color line and what it is to be a Black Latina in the world, not the world telling me I wasn't Mexican because I'm Black, and Black folks tell me I'm not Mexican because it's all the things, or you're not Latina enough because of your broken Spanglish, you know. When I decided to take this colonial Latin American history class at Roosevelt, and it completely shifted. And this was after I graduated from college and I was here in Chicago already. It completely shifted my perspective of the pain that I grew up in, because I started to learn about the diaspora and learn about the pain that Black women in Brazil were going through, the pain of Black women in Puerto Rico and Cuba, the pain and the hating themselves, hating the color of their skin, bleaching their elbows and knees, which I would cover up my knees and elbows with makeup because I was so ashamed that they were Black. And my mom would tell me that I needed to scrub them, right? And so when I started to see these stories reflected back to me, I realized it wasn't because I was this Black Mexican girl that was in Topeka, Kansas all by herself that was going through this because she's Nicole and this is what she's going through. This was a pain that was collective. It was a pain and a suffering that we were collectively experiencing as Black women all around the world when we were in places being told that we weren't good enough or that we didn't belong. So we did whatever we had to do to strip ourselves down, to strip the curls out of our hair, to strip the color off of our skin, to feel as though we fit in. And what I know my call in creation is to create stories where I am reflecting back to the little girls that didn't see themselves, that they are enough, that they belong just as they are. And I will tell those stories from my broken Spanglish, from my, I know about the cookout, but I was also like at the arrachera, so I don't, tell me a little more, you know, without shame, because I know I'm not the only one. And I won't let another little girl or another little human live in the lie that they are the only one going through that thing, because it's simply untrue. So for me, that is my call.
Clap for that, clap for that, clap for that. And that's, like I said, it's important for us to understand also the experiences of someone like yourself who has that mixed background, that is not just from the continent, you know, but also is from another part of the world.
I just want to add on that too. I think I didn't realize how ignorant as a culture in this country we are to just us being dropped off at different places until I moved to New York. And I saw when you go in the Bronx, and even the Bronx accent has a little bit of a Spanish-speaking twang to it because people are intermingled with one another. And when you talk about the original question of what our responsibility and one of our charges as storytellers, to those who have the range to do it, tell more stories, even if it's subtly, if it's overt, whatever, that really hones in on this collective shared history we have. I don't know if it happens as often as it should, and when it does happen, like the In the Heights movie, there are clear misses. I don't know if you guys remember, colorism was a part of that conversation.
You don't speak his name.
We won't speak that name, okay? So young Voldemort made that film, and no, it was but it let me know that, man, even though we say Black and brown and we say POC, we use these words to try to build a sense of shared community. There's nomenclature to let us know that we all are in this together. But I don't know if our work often enough reflects that in a way that can move the conversation forward. Not that it's not being created, but not that it's being amplified to the level that it should.
And sometimes it's filtered, right?
Yes.
Because you're kind of in, and I'm not gonna defend the film, you know, in the Heights, but I wonder sometimes if some of the creators were also working with an assumption of what Latino life looked like.
Oh, 100%.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so that, you know, was shaping everything. You're trying to get this project made, and then you're having to contend with this element of, well, explain yourself. You know, which is something, you know, Black creatives, especially when you start stepping outside of a kind of box of what Blackness is supposed to look like. You know, you can work with editors, you can work with producers, etc., who start saying, okay, wait a second, explain yourself. What do you mean you have a relationship to space and time?
Right.
What do you mean you have a relationship? What do you talk, you know, and you know, you explain, you start using these cultural reference points. But sometimes if people don't have the shared cultural reference points,
And you start to feel gaslit into believing that your lived experience is not germane to everybody else's. So you have a whole bunch of Black people in what's supposed to be a Latino movie, and they like, no, that's not what I think about when I think about Latins. You know? Then what do? It happened to me even Ytasha said something so poignant earlier about like the formulaic approach to stuff. So I'm coming to this space as a newsmaker who does like documentary stuff. So I'm learning from you guys as filmmakers. TV is so formulaic. You have 7 acts. You introduce the character in the first act. Second act, you make the person fall in love with the victim. It's a true life crime. Third act, there's a person that you think committed the crime. Fourth act, you get rid of the red herring. Fifth act, you know, we're getting closer to finding out who did it. By the 6th or the 7th, you get the resolution and then the message. It's all a big formula. And so then when you start to have conversations that are outside that formula, we did one story of a young girl who was killed by the name of Mujay Dambuya, and she was from Sierra Leone, was murdered in Michigan. And I remember I said, yo, we have to do a conversation about her history as immigrants. And I was like, well, what do you mean? What act would this fit in? It didn't fit into the formula. And as creators of color, sometimes we don't feel like we got agency in the room to say that this is an important part. You know, why would a true crime story need to tell an immigrant story? Well, what happened was they ended up, this family immigrated from Sierra Leone to escape a war condition. In Civil War, a lot was happening. Just for the daughter to come to Michigan and have something like that happen to her. And then her history and their religion and their culture made it such that when she was being abused by the guy who ended up being her killer, I should have said trigger warning before I go into the story. I'm trying to keep it vague because I know these are sensitive topics. Instead of being able to talk about what was done to her when she was touched, it was so taboo to talk about sex that she never felt comfortable telling her family about it. So how do we have that conversation without an African host saying that this history matters? And a producer, thankfully, who was on board with me. But if I didn't have that producer, I could have been gaslighting and thinking, no, this is irrelevant. Maybe this is a whole other documentary.
Breeze right over it.
You feel?
Yep.
So I think, you know, as creators, it's that knowing we have that agency and not letting ourselves be finessed out of our voice.
I was gonna ask him, please clap for that, please clap for that. Okay. It's so very important for us to be in these spaces because things like that happen. I was gonna ask you before you even said it about some of your experiences on the TV side and being one of very few, I'm sure, people of African descent that have agency, because you do have agency, to speak to what is important to us, what is culturally relevant, and what will make sense to us because we're also viewers, we're also consumers. And so, you know, please elaborate more as far as what you feel might even be an unfair responsibility on you to sometimes police these things.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
That was a hell of a question.
Made my chest tight.
It's right. It's the adjectives, the unfair. That's what got me. I got chills, I got goosebumps because there's this burden that we carry that I don't know if I look at it as a burden anymore. You know, it's like a mantle. You know what I mean? The biggest decision I made, it almost got made for me, was I almost changed my name when I got into the industry. My first job as a news anchor, I'll keep the story short, but you know, I have a meeting with the boss and she's like, yo, it's a Black-owned radio station, and Melody Span Cooper at WVON was one of the most influential persons in my life. And she said, yo, your name makes sense for us here, but I see a future with you going off at CNN and doing all these great things. Do you think you might want to consider changing your name easier to pronounce on air, easier to remember, blah, 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 blah. And
David.
you know, I don't know what I was going to pick. We didn't get that far. You know, and then I think Dom, somebody said, I hate Dom. You know, my name is Dometi, it's not Dom. Don't call me D, I don't really like D. And so I told my father, yo, anything about changing my name? And I just saw the look in his face. And he was like, yo, your name means the backbone of the pillar of the family, but if you need a job to be the backbone of the family, then you might need to do what you gotta do. But I went back and I said, no, I think, you know, I'll figure it out this way, you know. And if not for my name, even when I walk in rooms, I carry something that just makes the person who's talking to me, the producer, say, wait a minute, what's to that? Maybe we should listen to that Dometi guy in this Muche story, because I probably wouldn't have had that. You can't just look at me and see my Africanness. You can look at all of us and see it. But depending on where you come from, you might not notice little nuances about how close we are.
My brother, if I look at you, I see you are African. We will try that.
But even when I go to Ghana, it's like NK said though, like not being African enough. When I go to Ghana, they can tell from my gait, my walk, you know, my whole, the way I move my hands. They're like, this one.
America has come.
So, you know, but I said all that to say, so to answer your question more concisely, it was deciding to embrace my name, and I had this mantra that I went with for a long time, that's bring everything you are to everything you do.
Ooh, say that again.
Bring everything you are to everything you do.
That's why.
We go into the room, try to shrink ourselves, compartmentalize, and say, I'm not gonna mention this part of me because it won't fit. It's not, I gotta bring all of it. And it ended up opening doors that I never even conceived of. I was an intern at a black-owned radio station on the South Side. Now I got an office in Times Square.
Come on.
How did that happen? Yeah, because I'm happy. Because I'm happy.
It makes my heart
Because,
Great.
not in spite of. And I think, man, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Because I think that's inspiring for some of us who come from Afro-Latina backgrounds, who come from Afro-Cuban backgrounds and African backgrounds, who are in spaces where we don't feel that our voice has the agency that we could mention this thing. It's like, it's small, you know, in the grand scheme of things. Like, I mean, I get it, but yeah, we're just gonna breeze over it. And I don't think that is, well, I think it's criminal, because culturally we have a lot to offer. Even when you talk about the Black South in America, we understand that a lot of our culture in the Black South is derived and it is carried on and is passed on from things we did in Africa. And you know, I know we're a bit short on time, but I want to pass the conversation over to the Afrofuturistic aspect, because it's a subject I'm very interested in, and I think we don't talk about enough. But what do you feel like? I mean, we talk about, let me just contextualize things, right? We complain that we're tired of seeing stories about slavery, and our history doesn't begin at slavery. And so many of these conversations that we have amongst ourselves, yes, it is true. Our history begins thousands of years before slavery, and I'm hoping that we get to a place where we're getting the support to tell those stories. But I think in the meantime, what is really dope to me and innovative is the Afrofuturistic approach about what our future could be. And I think you're playing a very important role in that space as an Afrofuturistic storyteller. And I'm sure that's not all you are, but as someone who does tell stories in that vanguard, I'm really interested to know from your perspective, why do you think that's so important? And if you could keep it short, we want to wrap up and hear from Charlique as well, but why do you think that's so important?
Well, when you think about connecting to ideas of freedom, right? And we talk about Afrofuturism, it's a way of looking at futures and alternate realities through like these African diasporic lens. But it intersects these ideas of imagination, liberation, technology, and mysticism. And some of that liberation piece, you know, sometimes that liberation means I get to connect to my Africanness in a very free way and I can express that, right? And then sometimes that liberation piece is I can go into the spaces of the imaginary and reimagine myself. And so that space sort of takes you out of whatever conventions of Blackness that you may have been socialized into, to tell a kind of story that might better reflect who you are or where you would like to be. And it could be futuristic, or it could be alternative, or it could be in the here and now. It could be in the past. It could be all of these things. And that kind of freedom informs you. It transforms you in real time. So you're talking about a story in 2,000 years from now, but the actions that take place in that story transform you because you're thinking and imagining it in a present. And that present interconnects all these sides of ourselves. And so I feel that when we connect to that imaginary, it's not that we've never connected to it, it's that so much of who we've been socialized into says pragmatism. Step by step, where you are. Don't dream to do something that you can't finance yourself, and you this and you that. And so you can be socialized not to dream.
Yeah.
And that socialization of not dreaming shows up in your stories, which don't have any imaginative components to it. So, you know, with that, our imagination, it frees us, but it frees our storytelling to be able to better see ourselves.
Yes.
That's wonderful. You answered that perfectly. I'm just very honored to be able to share stage with you all. But the breadth of work that you all are up to right now, I'd be remiss if we don't chat about that to end things off. And I'm going to start with Charlique on the end at Congo Square and African American Arts Alliance. And if you could just briefly, we'll go down, kind of inform our audience here of the work that we all are doing, how they can be involved in that front.
Yeah, sure. So Congo Square Theater is one of the very few Black theaters in the city of Chicago and in the US. It is celebrating going into its 25th anniversary season, and we're getting ready to do open our next production, opening September 10th. And Welcome to Madison, which is highly Chicago specific, dealing with the housing justice. And what we do at Congo Square is really taking Black stories and blurring the line of how we utilize our art making as a form and vehicle of community organizing, community development, justice work, and thinking about how do we take these radical models, radical generosity, radical community, radical expansion, to expand just our storytelling into what it actually means to change society through our stories, particularly through Black stories. With the African American Arts Alliance, we are continuously, the African American Arts Alliance also is a 20+ year organization that exists to support individual artists and organizations of the diaspora to help continue to move us towards excellence as we define it. So we're going to be doing a Black Arts Month offerings in October, so lots of that information is going to be coming out soon. Congo Square Theater on all social platforms, as well as the African American Arts Alliance.
Come on, clap for her, clap for her. Please be sure to follow everyone here, because they're doing amazing things. Don't feel compelled. If you want to share anything that you guys are up to, please do share.
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that the Smithsonian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Black Smithsonian, has an Afrofuturism exhibit that's currently up. It'll be running through February. So if you have a chance to go to DC, I would encourage you to do so. I was quite surprised to see that I was a part of the exhibit.
Come on.
But it is really cool.
Imagine just walking through a museum exhibit at the Smithsonian and seeing somebody from the crib. I'm like, yo, I know her. And then she was outside at the reception table, just looking famous as ever, having lunch, sipping his cocktail. So yes, y'all gotta go see it. It was super dope, and I'm so proud to know you, sister.
I do want to remind you, I do have flyers for this book, Black Panther, A Cultural Phenomenon, so I'll just hand those out to you afterwards. And I would just like to acknowledge too that George Daniels is here, and George has always encouraged people to pursue their dreams and encouraged you in celebrating your individuality. So I just want to thank you, George, for always doing that for me when I started off as a journalist.
Round of applause for her as well. Ytasha, Pink Page, do you have anything you want to share with us, leave us with, etc.?
Share and leave. So things that I'm working on right now, I'm working on a short film that my first short film is now being turned into a episodic. So working on obviously things going on right now. We're working on it, but not working on it, but working on it. So it's independent. So that part of it. So it's called This Can't Be It, and it's a look at a woman re-entering the dating world in her late 30s and all the wildness that's going on. It's like, this can't be it. And so, it can't be it, guys, truly. So I'm really excited about that. Las Palabras is another one, my feature film that I've been continually working on. And then I also do healing body work, Pilates and yoga instructor, and have my own athleisure line, Thickletic, where we work to elevate the ideology around wellness and inclusivity by cultivating conversation, clothing, and community. And I just finished up a 12-week program with Target that I was really excited about.
Yes.
And so we'll be launching the bodysuits and the leggings, and towards the end of Q4, and they will drop at your door on Valentine's Day to love on yourself. So you can go to IamThickletic.com and find out more about that, and you can follow me on the grams, the books, and all the things at All Things NK, and I Am Thickletic, because it's an I Am statement.
Come on, round of applause, okay. Personally, I run a production company, boutique production company. We focus on development as well. It's called Out the Box Creative Group, based out of Chicago. We have outfits in Ghana and LA as well. We focus on storytelling in every form, documentary, short form, and hopefully in the next few years we'll be showing you some feature-length stuff. And so you catch me doing all those things, telling nuanced stories, and especially in the documentary space. And I'll pass that on to Dometi.
And if you have Amazon Prime, check out True Life Crime. It focuses on the humanity of the victims and the world that they grew up in, not just the crime or what happened. It's less voyeuristic than a lot of shows in that space. So definitely support it if you can. Follow me on all of the things, because unfortunately followers matter. It helps me get opportunities, so I would greatly appreciate it. And lastly, I just want to give a takeaway that I thought of in real time as you guys were talking. Just reconnect with the intention of why you do the work. I think a lot of our work comes through the lens of other people watching it, unfortunately sometimes the white lens, where somebody's gonna say, I was looking at the films and I was just thinking, somebody's gonna say, this is too sad, we wanna see Black joy. Someone else is gonna say that we see Black joy, but it's not our lived reality. And I saw films today that did all of that because those people were authentically telling the story of their reality, and that's why we related to each of those films. So all creatives, and I'm telling myself in real time, ignore the noise, reconnect with your intention, and create what it is that God told you to create.
Round of applause for Dometi. We're gonna round this off. I really appreciate you all for sitting through our conversation. The last thing I'll leave you all with is to really be a part of your community. Be a part of your filmmaking community. Be a part of your storytelling community, and storytelling community. Don't feel that you cannot reach out to your guy sitting next to you and the lady sitting next to you to ask for resources. We are going to help each other within this ecosystem of especially independent filmmaking, and we have to help each other. And so I just encourage you all to continue to always know that you can reach out to people in your filmmaking community and outside of your filmmaking community to be resources to you. And you also have the responsibility as a Black storyteller, if you are a Black storyteller, to be a resource to someone else.
Yeah.
And so thank you all for our conversation. This is the Role of Diaspora. Round of applause for yourselves.
Keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. Thank you all so much.